In 1958, Dr. Joshua Lederberg, a molecular biologist born in Montclair, New Jersey, was the youngest person to ever have received the honor of an award of the Nobel Prize. And many today associate this Nobel laureate with the phrase lifted and isolated from context that had appeared in an ensemble cast Hollywood production in 1995, starring Kevin Spacey, Dustin Hoffman, Rene Russo, Patrick Dempsey, Donald Sutherland, Morgan Freeman, and one later Oscar Award winner who, at least according to Politico, shares my birthday, Cuba Gooding Jr. At least a connection by temporal coincidence. That film was titled Outbreak, a film about a DOD created virus that had, escaped and then gone on to threaten a town called Cedar Creek, California, and which had premiered in March 1995 when I had, again at least by temporal coincidence, been assigned in echelon above Corps, Strategic Counterintelligence, working in other duties as assigned, essentially as a biological warfare planner. Framed during the opening scenes of the film, the quotation appears to take on an entirely different meaning to the viewers in the audience. The single biggest threat to man's continued dominance on the planet is the virus. In the COVID-19 pandemic in April 2020, Robin Marantz Hennig at National Geographic, a scientific publication, had added an additional phrase attributed to the Nobel laureate, Dr. Lederberg, that we could do little better than to sit back and wait for the avalanche. A context quite different from the Marburg virus and Ebola virus-inspired pathogen that had been the topic of that film that hit the theaters in 1995. A decade after Dr. Lederberg had been bestowed the honor of being awarded the Nobel Prize, another recipient of that coveted award and friend of my father had become immortalized as a civil rights martyr at the age of 39 on a motel balcony in Memphis, just outside the door of room 306, the King Abernathy Suite at the Laureate Motel. At least by temporal coincidence, again, just 3 years before, in September 1965, when my mom was just 6 months pregnant with me, that chain smoker, most responsible for the ashtrays in the home of a teetotaling Baptist minister and visitor at our family home when in the New York area, had been awarded an honorary degree at St. Peter's College, a Jesuit college in New Jersey, that had celebrated its 150th year anniversary just 2 years ago in 2022, along with my high school alma mater, St. Peter's Prep. Some may recall the Cinderella run of the St. Peter's Peacocks in March Madness during the celebration of their 150th year anniversary, when they became the first 15 seed basketball team to reach the Elite Eight in the NCAA brackets, described even by CBS News as a magical, almost miraculous moment. But for me, not many people can say that a Nobel laureate used to eat dinner at their family home. And nobody else could have forced my mother to go out and actually purchase ashtrays to place in her home. As much as a fighter as she tended to be, not even my mother was about to tell Reverend King that he had to take his nasty habit outside. Although that much quoted black preacher and actually been only a C student in homiletics, the art of preaching, as seminarians know, at the Crozier Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, the one thing that you have to appreciate about Reverend King in what has been described as his aspirational style of public address, where his skills in the art of phrasing controversial topics in a diplomatic manner, which requires a degree of skill, patience, empathy, timing, and near perfection in delivery, something that not many people can do, and certainly not do very well as he had. But an understanding and appreciation of the language of diplomats, central to averting a crisis even during those 13 days in October, when the U.S. and the former Soviet Union had been on the brink of nuclear conflagration, arising from the placement of missiles on the island of Cuba, well within the range of Miami, is even required in understanding the words exchanged between Washington and Beijing on the origins of the novel virus. And I have to say particularly that Chinese diplomats tend to be very skilled in phrasing matters during diplomatic crises, and we'll get into that. But without this understanding of of the matter, one would be quite lost, only catching a partial glimpse of the complexity of the topic of the debated origins of the virus, which has to be clearly understood to appropriately address the problem about which even Dr. Christian G. Anderson, the author of the most cited scientific work on the possible origins, had stated, alongside his colleague Dr. Edward C. Holmes. Failure to comprehensively investigate the zoonotic origin through collaborative and carefully coordinated studies would leave the world vulnerable to future pandemics arising from the same human activities that have repeatedly put us on a collision course with the novel virus. Yet, whenever we see a story on CNN or Fox News, depending upon your preference, involving international relations and diplomacy, we are joining a program that is already in progress. Like in high school drama, where young thespians will spend at least about 6 weeks in production, rehearsing lines, building sets, selecting costumes and props, and arranging lighting and blocking cues just for 3 to 5 days of performance before a live audience. There is a lot that occurs before something appears suddenly as breaking news on television or as a audio report on NPR. And to gain a deeper appreciation of the situation between Beijing and Washington on this question of the origins of the novel virus, believe it or not, you would have to take a mental journey back in time, even before the age of perestroika and the solidarity movement that had preceded the falling of the wall in Berlin in the Reagan and Bush years, to the age of detente in the Nixon administration, where Kissinger and Nixon, through the transformative powers of diplomacy, had opened the doors to China, when a key part of the agreement had centered around, believe it or not, the signing on to the United Nations Biological Weapons Convention, PWC. Joining the other civilized nations around the world in really essentially just saying no to biological warfare, a lofty and noble goal. It would take a total of 10 years, however, before Beijing, discussing with their lawyers and other interested parties, had finally yielded and agreed to deposit accession documents at the United Nations in New York, as well as with government officials in Moscow and Washington. And in 1984, that Orwellian year, the envoys from Beijing had ceremoniously attached a note to mark the historic occasion and clarify their position in all candor when joining the union of other civilized nations around the world, indicating, of course, in mutual assurances, as diplomats do, that the basic spirit of the convention on the prohibition of biological weapons conforms to China's consistent position and is conducive to the efforts of the world's peace-loving countries and peoples in fighting against aggression and maintaining world peace. while empathetically emphasizing that China was once the victims of biological, bacteriological weapons itself, back at the hand of the Japanese during World War II, experiments with anthrax in the Manchurian region, which should resonate with those amenable to emotional appeals with high emotional IQ. And here, for the discerning, it is where the fullest appreciation of the art of diplomacy provides an instructive glimpse, because according to the diplomatic emissaries at that time, China had not produced or possessed such weapons and would, of course, never do so in the future, which sounds very assuring as a statement. However, by 2019, the U.S. State Department had reported on biological weapons and said in 2010 it was noted that China possessed an offensive BW program prior to its accession to the BWC in 1984, and was obligated at that time to eliminate this program upon acceding to the convention. And so, at least according to U.S. officials, what Beijing diplomats had stated was clearly not entirely forthcoming in 1984. But also, and this is important to note, not a deal breaker for China joining the agreement against biological weapons. And the best way to appreciate and understand how this happens, this peculiar relationship and language between diplomats, is to examine what Beijing emissaries had added to their note in 1984. In the spirit of international cooperation, of course, that the Chinese government considers that the convention has its defects, stating as an example specifically, noting of the agreement that it fails to provide in explicit terms for the prohibition of the use of biological weapons and the concrete and effective measures for supervision and verification. And it lacks forceful measures of sanctions in the procedure of complaint against instances of violation of the convention. However, they had diplomatically also added in that same spirit of international cooperation that it is the hope of the Chinese government that these defects may be made up or corrected at an appropriate time, and we shall overcome someday. In Sesame Street simplicity, the Beijing diplomats had said that they agreed to sign the treaty against biological weapons because it's a very, very nice thing to say and do, but had noted that it was just a beautiful set of words expressing a utopian and ideal state of affairs, pleasant for those visiting Disneyland, but had lacked any enforcement provisions, and to let us know that they were neither naive nor stupid enough to think it was otherwise. And with this more refined understanding, brings us to the present-day controversy arising from the novel virus, as some say they believe had arisen from a natural spillover from an animal reservoir in zoonosis to a human host, while others say they believe that the virus had, escaped from a lab. And in May 2021, shortly before President Joe Biden had tasked the intelligence community to redouble efforts to determine the origins of the novel virus, today attributed to more deaths worldwide than Hitler in the Holocaust in half the time, British intelligence agencies had evolved to the earlier position that had been advanced by former MI6 Director Sir Richard Dearlove, and then agreed that they then believe it was feasible that the global pandemic began with a coronavirus leak from a Chinese research laboratory, which kind of suggests an image of some event that was left open. Stated in diplomatic social distance, Sir Richard Dearlove, a former MI6 director, agency for James Bond, the equivalent of the American CIA with international jurisdiction, and speaking as a retiree in more social distance, in the first year of the pandemic, had been at odds with the position of the current MI5, or the equivalent of the FBI, more focused on domestic, Relations, the director, and in following diplomatic pronouncements, symbolism and nuance is important. And words, like often in law and in courts, have particular meaning, with consequences turning on simply the interpretation of a phrase, terms of art, which could mean the same thing to parties in agreement, or could mean very different things to achieve an agreement, but an acceptable public expression, enabling both sides to save face. Very, very key. In May 2021, the BBC had reported that in a significant sharpening of tension with Beijing, world leaders were investigating a possible leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which Beijing angrily insisted was not the source of the virus, that had caused, at that point, more than 3.5 million deaths worldwide, half of where it is today, and was still raging globally. According to reports in the Western press, this pressure for investigation and resulting controversy was growing about the alleged silencing of scientists who wanted an investigation of the lab leak theory, while British, American, and other Western intelligence agencies had appeared to be reversing their earlier positions that had discounted the possibility entirely of the Virology Institute playing any role in a pandemic. The long journey begins with the first step, and you cannot resolve a problem unless you first admit that there is a problem, so that dialogue can begin. And not until May 2021, after reassessment, some time to think about it, evolve, did members of the intelligence community begin diplomatically moving closer to a position early advanced by former MI6 director Sir Richard Dearlove, beginning to embrace the idea that a lab escape had been at least feasible. I'm not saying definitively happened, just feasible. Baby steps. As a theory for the origin, sources revealed even the U.S. intelligence community, of which the FBI is a part, had earlier coalesced around only two likely scenarios, but had not reached a definitive conclusion on this question, leaving wiggle room. As presented, the central question on the origins of COVID-19 appears to be whether it had emerged, two possibilities, emerged from human contact with an infected animal or from a laboratory accident. However, making slow but steady progress, according to the BBC, on the 1st of March 2023, FBI Director Christopher Wray had gone further, pushing the envelope, directly accusing Beijing of doing its best to try to thwart and obfuscate the investigation into the proximal origins of a novel virus with which we were hit that was met with silence and spread unchecked, and described in an address by President Joe Biden on the first anniversary of the pandemic declarations as being characterized by denials for days, weeks, and months that led to more deaths, more infections, more stress, more loneliness. But on March 1st, 2023, FBI Director Wray had disclosed that the Bureau had been convinced of the lab leak theory for quite some time now, but it was only then making news. However, the FBI had not made their findings public, which has frustrated some scientists. Meanwhile, in Beijing, China's foreign ministry had accused the U.S. of political manipulation and blame shifting, and has rejected any link at all between COVID-19 and any virus research in the Chinese city of Wuhan. And here, like when dealing with attorneys, attention to details, particularly nuances in language and phrasing, assists in understanding the Beijing position that certainly on appearance suggests antagonistic and abrasive intentions, if not flat-out contradictions, juxtaposed in position to Western authorities and now the intelligence agencies, but not necessarily, if you understand the syntax argument they have advanced, with particular attention to emphasis on Wuhan as the place of origin, in categorical exclusion of any other possible or even plausible locations, and also with the emphasis on the action word, object, and a subject, or also a verb. Three basic parts of a sentence. Emphasis on the term lab leak or escape, introducing possibilities that have to be considered. And so framed within this very specific context, searching for the diplomatic truth within statements of the Beijing government officials, we might first turn to the press statement issued by the World Health Organization at the time of the pandemic declaration, at which time they had stated expressly, describing the situation as a pandemic does not change WHO's assessment of the threat posed by this virus. As even Julia Belluz, a reporter for Vox Media, had stated on the day after the pandemic declaration, the P word doesn't say anything about the severity of COVID-19 because a disease can spread widely and become a pandemic without being particularly severe. The WHO director himself, in his official statement, had stressed the point that we cannot say this loudly enough, or clearly enough, or often enough. All countries can still change the course of this pandemic. And what was that threat about which world public health officials, who had stated on page 33 of a 40-page report that there are guidelines for elderly care specifically targeting prevention in individuals and introduction of COVID-19 to nursing homes, say, well, take out your report and you will see on page 35 of that 40-page report, after some 1,800 teams of at least 5 epidemiologists, the manpower equivalent of 2 military maneuver brigades with boots on ground and eyes on the objective, had by February 20th, 2020, examined 19 times more cases than had yet been reported by mid-March 2020 in the entire United States, and concluded on page 35, it is not clear whether this correlates with the presence of an infectious virus, which could not plausibly then escape from any laboratory to set off a pandemic, much less even a zoonotic evolution. They concluded on page 19 that clusters appear to have driven the outbreak. They had concluded on page 35 that because there are distinct patterns of intrafamilial transmission of COVID-19, this aspect required further study to determine the role of possible host factors, including genetic factors that influence susceptibility or disease course. They were looking at 55,000 cases and were suspecting that it might be family-driven, not an infectious disease. On page 11, they had concluded that infected children had largely been identified through contact tracing in households of adults. And on page 12, had noted the clinical finding that disease in children appears to be relatively rare and mild, with approximately 2.4% of the total reported cases among individuals aged under 19 years. Today, even the folks at UNICEF will tell you that less than 18,000 persons aged 20 and under had died from COVID-19, from over 7 million dead. There, they had stated explicitly that the Joint Mission Team could not recall episodes in which transmission occurred from a child to an adult. Yet, people are talking about children being super spreaders. Most importantly, addressing the probability of catching the disease at all, expressed through secondary attack rate derived from painstaking examination of thousands of trace contacts per day, on page 8 of this 40-page report. 1/5 through a 40-page report, they had determined that between 1% and 5% of the contacts were subsequently laboratory-confirmed cases of COVID-19, depending on location. That is your chances of getting into Harvard. That is your chances of winning on a 2-number combination at roulette. Moreover, on page 12, they had concluded that with words in bold-faced type, like keywords to remember and understand in a 3rd-grade science textbook, that while asymptomatic infection had been reported, it appeared to be relatively rare and does not appear to be a major driver of transmission. did you read the damn report? Clinicians distinguish between symptoms which require a differential diagnostic method to determine, like taking a temperature, conducting tests, or eliciting patient responses in an intake interview, while asymptomatic signs of infection, your asymptomatic transmission, are those possible indicators of illness that anyone can observe, such as coughing and sneezing. Viruses do not radiate. We have long gone past the age of miasmas, prompting the phrase of the initial guidelines from even the CDC, the virus is thought to spread mainly from person to person between people who are in close contact with one another within about 6 feet through respiratory droplets produced when an infected person coughs, sneezes, or talks. Thought that these droplets can land in the mouths or noses of people who are nearby or possibly be inhaled into the lungs, and thought that COVID-19 may be spread by people who are not showing symptoms. Who thought that? Clearly anyone who had failed to read the damn report, 40 pages, despite the evolutionary pressures of a lethal pandemic. And that was all that the CDC had stated in their guidance, about which apparently many had misunderstood or just simply failed to read or comprehend what exactly the syntax, even in that early guidance, had said. Holy smokes, how did our intelligence miss us? By late January 2020, perhaps you had seen the story on television with Dr. Sanjay Gupta, health expert for CNN, reporting the news story that snakes could be the source of the Wuhan coronavirus outbreak, possibly Chinese crate or king cobra. Or perhaps you read the science report published by Wei Ji in mid-February 2020, which has confirmed a snake or ophidian codon usage bias for the novel coronavirus, which would, to a microbiologist or virologist, make this an amazingly aberrant from nature and alien finding, because coronavirus infections are exclusive to mammalian and avian species, responsible for over 3,000 types of infections in each. However, there are no reptilian coronaviruses exist at all in nature, making this zoonotic evolution truly quite extraordinary, and more likely clear evidence that this virus that could not possibly, with only a less than 5% chance of infecting anyone, had found its origins not in nature but in a lab, from which over 70% of the fatalities were the elderly, a clinical fact apparently missed even by the scientists who claimed that the virus had been the result of a natural spillover from an animal host to a human. Or perhaps the claim is that we are not plants and all just animals. Oh, the humanity. Holy smokes. This message was approved by Major Mike Webb. Honest. This has been a Filmways presentation, darling. And y'all come back now. Yeah.